I was given this title, Companies versus the People, and I was rather concerned about what I was being asked to speak on. Was I being asked to speak on really the entire context of global capitalism? Huh? Is that the theme of the day? Well, no, I thought perhaps I shouldn't start down that route. I'd never get to the end. So I rather decided to focus on what I know best and to focus a little bit more on something that is going on in my own research. So the title today is Companies versus the Public. This isn't always the case, but it certainly is frequently the case in contexts of natural resource extraction. And here I'm talking specifically about the extraction of natural resources from mining and oil and gas extraction. And my own research has really been focused on these processes, the politics of resources in Latin America. So I'm going to bring you back to territory that I know best. And I'm going to give you very much a picture, which is in three parts. A picture of increasing attacks and violence against human rights and environmental activists across the world, but particularly in Latin America. And also to look at the particular concentration of these kinds of attacks in Colombia, a context where power asymmetries between companies and communities are particularly marked. And this is very much a picture asymmetries which are very much aided by, of course, a context of ongoing, now ending, armed conflict, but also by very powerful actors, both within illegal crime syndicates, but also as well within the state, powerful actors within the state itself. This is very much a picture perhaps that's distinct from the one that we saw last week when we were, of course, celebrating the peace accords and celebrating the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to President Santos. There is still very many things going on in Colombia that have to be dealt with, and this picture of violence is certainly one of them. And lastly, I'm going to give you some indications of the linkages between corporations involved in extraction in Colombia and illegal armed groups. There are many signs of relationships, direct relationships, between mining corporations, oil corporations, and paramilitary or criminal organizations. And so I'm going to touch on that towards the end. So the reason I've been asked to come and talk here is about of course, my background as a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, but also to do with my boots on the ground, my qualitative anthropological research on resource politics in Latin America. I don't work from an office. I don't work from data sets far from the context itself. I travel there. I spend time there, long periods of time. I believe my wife is very unhappy about no matter how much time I spend there. But it requires time to be spent amongst populations, amongst communities, talking with people and trying to understand their worldviews. I'm currently involved in a Norwegian Research Council funded project called Extracting Justice, which is focused on the legal and political mechanisms for environmental governance within the extractive sector, and where we're working, in fact, in 4 Andean countries. I also, as part of that work, have current experience working directly with environmental activists in Tolima, in Colombia, who are currently under constant physical threat because of their campaign for a consulta popular, or a local referendum on plans to build one of the largest gold mines in the Americas, the so-called La Calosa project. They're a group of people who are making a very similar claim to other groups in Latin America, that essentially that water is more valuable than gold. This is a common slogan now that we find amongst many other environmental movements in Latin America. The threats that are being made to them, these are threats by a criminal organization who threaten individuals directly by letter, by email, or by SMS. My contacts in Tolima are constantly receiving on their smartphones texts threatening their lives and threatening their families' lives. This is occurring in a context where more generally in Colombia, these threats are also being realized. We are seeing a whole series of beatings and also assassinations taking place. There have been 72 assassinations of human rights activists this year alone. 24 since Santos signed the peace accord with the FARC in Cartagena. So this is a picture that's ongoing, right? But just to try and sort of bring this home a little bit, a larger picture first. This is a figure that's been taken from a report that was put together by Global Witness in 2015, essentially saying, or showing the numbers of attacks on human rights activists across the world. And where they make very clear claim in their report that in 2015 was the deadliest on record. And what I want to point out from this map up here is there are two things I want to point out. One is the concentration of these attacks in Latin America, and the other is the concentration of these attacks primarily on indigenous peoples, but then beyond that, indigenous peoples also thinking about human rights, environmental activists, and union leaders. Right? So essentially, as a group in total, we're talking about human rights activists. One other element I think that maybe can be drawn from this is that a lot of these attacks are directly attached to processes of extraction of natural resources, mining and oil and gas exploration. There are direct relationships in the context surrounding these attacks. Now, why is this picture developing? What's happening here? Now, there are different things that we could focus on if we were going to look at that more in a more focused way. We could look at, for example, the fact that, of course, the international community and civil society more generally are much more aware of human rights now than ever before. They're much more aware of the claims that they can make, and therefore make those claims. That will also lead, of course, into confrontations. We also see the expansion of the extractive frontier. Over the last decade or more, there have been very high prices for commodities in international markets. And so there's been a significant expansion then of the extraction of natural resources across the world, but particularly in Latin America, where countries on the left and right of the political spectrum have dedicated their economies to the extraction of natural resources. I'll show a little bit more about that in a minute. We can also maybe pick out on the fact that now there are more governance mechanisms than ever before to try and create dialogue, to try and create some kind of connection with local populations. We have court cases, we have alternative dispute mechanisms, we have also, of course, the application of prior consultations connecting to ideas of free, prior and informed consent. We have mechanisms such as environmental and social impact assessments. We have different forms of territorial planning and mapping and so on. All of these new governance mechanisms, which have been also given quite a significant support by states and by corporations. By corporations in terms of their operation regulations. What's unusual, what's not normally picked up in this, and unfortunately is not being picked up by international organizations, is that despite the creation of all of these mechanisms for dialogue, the level of conflict, the levels of disagreement in areas where extraction is taking place are increasing. They're not getting less, they're getting more. There's more and more of them. And lastly, we can also talk about the alliances that seem to exist, and there are very many strong indications of this, of the alliances between corporations and armed actors, something that I will certainly come back to. So very quickly now, move quickly. This is a picture, a map of Latin America and of all the concessions, oil and gas concessions and mining concessions across the area. You can see there's a concentration as well of this along the Andean area, and throughout Andean countries, essentially along the eastern flanks of the Andes and following down into the Amazonian area. This has to do with essentially the geology of that area of the world. This is where the resources are, and therefore, of course, that's where the concessions are going to be found. But they're also, as this frontier expands, then they're expanding into areas that haven't really been exposed to this before, and new conflicts arise as a result of that. And this also explains why, in our project, in this project I've mentioned, Extracting Justice, that we're working in Andean countries, because that's where the concentration of the problems are. This is a map that's taken from the Environmental Justice Atlas, an atlas which has been put together by a social observatory, essentially, a group working from the University of Barcelona, connected to the very famous economist Joan Martínez-Alier, which demonstrates points of socio-environmental conflict across the world, but also specifically looking also at Latin America, as you can see. And again, you can see that there's an overlap then between this map and the previous map, in terms of you have concessions and then where there are actually social environmental conflicts taking place. They are taking place essentially again along the spur of the Andean area. Now what's going on here, of course, in terms of conflict, is that there is a mismatch. On the one hand, there are great expectations by states about the possible win from the extraction of natural resources, the way that this can add to the public coffers. So there are great expectations about the increase in possibility of returns to the national economy. At the same time, local communities, what they experience is that their local economies aren't being bettered by this. There aren't improved possibilities for employment. There are quite clearly also a whole series of quite direct impacts on their local environment, direct problems of contamination in terms of their natural environment, but also impacts as well on local social organisation and traditional structures. There are terrible frustrations, therefore, being created about what's being promised on the one hand and what they receive on the other. And this leads into the direction, of course, of protest. This is further, also I would have to add as well, this is made worse by the fact that a whole series of political leaders in the area also dismiss the claims of local communities in terms of trying to adjust the terms of extraction to look for forms of mitigation. A whole series of political leaders, including President Santos himself, have been coming out with more and more extreme rhetoric regarding these protesters. They are referred to as being fundamentalists, as being radicals, as being extremists, as being jihadis, and so on. A language what quite clearly ups the ante, that makes the whole situation, the atmosphere surrounding extraction and the politics of extraction ever more extreme. We also see a heightening level of securitization of sites of extraction, where there are both military forces being sent into the area, but also the hiring of private security companies in order to look after these areas. Now, as we go on, we see that the picture of protest and conflict isn't one just directly of a confrontation between protesters and police and military forces. No? There are other forms of violence which are also taking place. And sadly, one of the very sad parts of the picture that we see in Latin America developing is an increase in the number of targeted killings. These are essentially the faces and the names of people who've been killed in Colombia over the last year. This is from a report that's taken from the Washington office on Latin America that was published just last week. Yeah. So these are very clear evidences of people being assassinated, and also the people being the terms in which these killings are taking place. Now, why is this taking place, and who is responsible for it? Well, there are quite clear connections to be made with a whole series of paramilitary or organized criminal organizations in the country, in Colombia. In fact, responsibility for these assassinations is directly claimed by them. So threats come from these organizations, and then there is also a recognition that they are responsible for these killings themselves. One of the things in Colombia that has occurred is that back in the past, there were a whole series of paramilitary organizations. These paramilitary organizations were formally disbanded back in 2012, but unfortunately, despite their formal disbanding, many of the members of those paramilitary organizations have gone on to then also found new organizations, new what they call backrim organizations, bandas criminales, organized crime syndicates. These are different from the cartels. We're not here referring to the drug cartels, although many of these criminal organizations also have a hand in the drugs trade. But these are not the big cartels. These are small organizations who have their roots in paramilitary organizations. And there are many of them in Colombia. And you can see the different names which are now being taken. Uribistas, Rostrojos, Black Eagles, Meta Block, and many others that are there. What we see is that we get, these are letters that are being sent. As I mentioned, SMSs are being sent and emails, but also formal letters are being sent by these organizations, threatening people directly because they're involved in environmental activism, because they're involved in human rights organizations. Now, I said there should be a connection, of course, as well to corporations, and there is a lot of evidence of this. The problem is evidencing this, of course, in a court of law, but certainly there are many evidences in terms of research. And this is one paper that does this. And if you look on the internet, you'll see multiple reports that claim the same things. This is one by Angelica Redberg, a paper that was written for the Norwegian Peacebuilding Research Centre, where she quite clearly makes a connection between extraction and also paramilitary organizations. So she writes, in addition, legal mineral resources such as coal, ferronickel, gold and oil, as well as several agricultural products such as bananas and palm oil, have also become linked to illegal actors' economic activities. Producers have paid protection money, supplementing illegal actors' income. Furthermore, illegal organizations have become directly involved in resource extraction, both in order to generate revenue and to launder money derived from illicit crops and the drug trade. And here we have also a figure which is also backing this up. Now what I want to end on, because I'm going to have to move towards an end, is to actually name names as well. And the one name that I want to at least get over is the name of one corporation, and that is of Anglo Gold Ashanti. Now Anglo Gold Ashanti is the third largest gold mining concern in the world, which has its headquarters in South Africa, but the majority of its investors are in the United States. Now the company and its subsidiaries, and this is just a map from a recent report mapping out essentially all of the subsidiaries, and it's quite a monster that exists in Colombia. They in fact own the majority of mining concessions in the country. The company and their subsidiaries have mining concessions in over 15,000 kilometers of the country. And several investigations carried out in Colombia have shown that in 336 municipalities in which the transnational Anglo Gold Ashanti Company was active, paramilitary groups have directly and systematically attacked the civilian population through actions such as extrajudicial executions, torture, disappearances and forced relocations. 70% of the municipalities in which this transnational corporation was active or claimed to be pursuing exploration work are regions where the paramilitaries have a strong presence and where there is well-known consequences for human rights. Now I also mention this corporation because they are directly involved in the case study where I am working currently for my project. They're directly involved in Tolima. They're responsible, they are the owners of the La Colosa project. And in Tolima, what we see, what I've been witnessing, is their use of both legal and illegal means, essentially to stop the claims that are being made locally for a popular referenda. To stop, essentially, the use of existing legal process, of existing Colombian law. They do that through both, on the one hand, using, of course, their money, their financial clout in terms of being able to hire lawyers and also to manipulate and massage the national legal system and to look for loopholes that they can use in order to slow down and delay the process of the referenda. But they can also use as well their connections to paramilitary organizations to also indirectly threaten people who are involved in the movement for the referenda. Right now, in the region of Tolima, the security officer for Anglo Gold Ashanti is a known ex-member of a paramilitary organization, and has also been caught multiple times in using social media in order to encourage attacks on human rights activists in the area. The last thing I need to mention just about Anglo Gold before I leave as well is that this isn't, its activities in Colombia are one thing, but it's actually known as a corporation to have carried out similar activities, similar connections to paramilitary organizations in other parts of the world. Mostly well known for its connections to paramilitary organizations in the Congo, together with Barrick Gold, a company that interestingly also has a connection to George Bush Sr. So there are these rich webs then of interest between corporations and paramilitary organizations, which are creating a picture of violence, which is very clearly represented, very clearly seen in the context of Colombia, but clearly also taking place in other parts of the world as well. I'm going to end it. Thanks very much.